Good afternoon, Dwayne. Tack Room Bible Talk. Haven't posted anything on here in a while. I've got a story in the Old Testament that's kind of been running around in my mind, and I want to share that with you today. This is going to be a new story for some of you, maybe a different concept, but I want to share it. If in the New Testament, I should look this up. The Apostle Paul tells the church that the things in the Old Testament, the stories in the Old Testament, the things in the law, the things about the temple and the tabernacle, the furniture, the offerings, all that stuff was given to us for examples, he calls it. They're pictures. All through the Old Testament, God gives us metaphors that are pointing to Christ. We're told in the book of John, when John closes out the Gospel of John, he says, many other things Jesus did, and I suppose if all of it were written down, the world could not contain the books. If you stop and think about the Bible, which is the story of God, which is the story of Jesus, and how actually physically small it is, in comparison to everything that God obviously has done and is doing and will do and all that he wants, it's amazingly small. Okay? And so it stands to reason that everything in here has a purpose. There's no wasted space. There is no wasted word. And many of the stories in the Old Testament that were like, that doesn't make sense. Why is that even there? It's not wasted. It all has a purpose. And so much of it is to point to Christ. All the way back, if you go back to the story of Noah, God shut the door on Noah and his family when the flood came. Noah couldn't shut that door. God shut the door, and it says God sealed the door. And so when destruction came, those who believed God were sealed by God. Okay? People really have a hard time with the story of Abraham and Isaac. When God told Abraham, sacrifice your son. So Abraham took his son up to sacrifice him. And right there at the last second, the voice came down and said, do him no harm. And a ram was provided. People really get troubled by that. Isaac was never in any physical danger. Never. Isaac was the promised seed to Abraham. God promised Abraham specifically, I will give you a son of your own bloodline, and he will be the father of many nations, and the Messiah will come through him. God doesn't lie. And so Abraham in faith said, well, God doesn't lie. So God tested Abraham's faith. Isaac was never in any danger. All right. But the thing is, Isaac was placed on the altar as a sacrifice, and a substitute that Abraham did not provide, that Isaac did not provide, was given in Isaac's place at the last minute. And that substitute, the ram caught in a thicket, shed its blood so that Isaac did not have to die on the altar. It was a picture. It was an example. It was a metaphor, a living, breathing metaphor, so that when Christ came, we could say, this is not something new. This is something that we have been shown. All of these centuries, we've been shown that this is God's heart. Okay? So there's a story here in Genesis I want to read, and then I want to explain it. Okay? And I want to point something out. Okay? So in Genesis chapter 15, it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eleazar of Damascus. So Abraham says, God, before you promised that I would have a son, now I'm an old man. And you're saying here, I'm thy shield and I am thy exceeding great reward. Well, what are you going to give me, seeing that I'm an old man now? And the steward of my house, the steward would be his chief manager, his chief butler, this guy named Eleazar, who was from Damascus. He said, that's the closest thing to a male heir that I have. And Abraham said in verse number 3, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. Now, Abraham could not bear children. Now, this is important. This is something Abraham was physically unable to do. So God said, you're going to have an heir. This is my promise to you. But there was nothing Abraham could do to fulfill that promise. Now, he tried. We see later on with Hagar, and that turned out to be a huge mess. But God made a promise, and there was nothing that Abraham could do on his side to do his part to fulfill that promise that God gave him. And behold, the word of the Lord, verse number 4, came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, this Eleazar, the steward, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Verse number 6 says, And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. So God made a promise to Abraham. Abraham could not physically do anything on his side to help this out. He was completely and totally helpless. But he believed God, and God said, That is your righteousness. You believe me, I'm going to count that as your righteousness. Verse number 7, And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? Now this is where this starts, okay? Verse number 9, And he, God, said unto him, Abram, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all of these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds divided he not. So what he did was, he took this heifer and this goat, and he cut them, he killed them, and he cut them in half, nose to tail, down the back more. So you got two pieces. And he laid one piece like this, and he laid the other piece like this. So there's the heifer. And here's the goat. He cut it down the middle, and he laid one piece like this, and the other piece was laid out like this. All right? Now, if you do some study on this, this was actually an ancient practice among peoples who had to make serious covenants with each other. This is actually takes place in other places in the Old Testament. One, it's mentioned in Jeremiah 35:19. God had done this at one point with Israel, and Israel had broken all of them. But they had divided the calf and had walked between the calf as a covenant. We're going to keep our covenant. We're going to do another covenant with God. Okay? And so this is a practice back then that they did. All right, it was something Abraham would have been very familiar with. I don't know where it originated. I don't know all the symbolism behind it. All right, but it was something they did back then. And he took unto him, verse number 10, all of these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcass, Abraham drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. So now the two parts, so the way they normally did this, if two kings were making a covenant, both kings would make the covenant and they would both walk in between these divided carcasses of these animals. So Abraham's waiting for God. Abraham can't do this on his own. So he's waiting for God. And so now as the buzzards start coming down, he drives the buzzards away and he keeps it clean. And it gets dark and Abraham goes to sleep. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said, God, said unto Abram, know of a surety. This is guaranteed, this is promised. God himself said, know of a surety, that thy seed shall be a stranger in a strange land. So he's doing a prophecy of Israel when they go down to Egypt in the time of Jacob. Joseph and his brothers, shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. They're going to Egypt. And shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Your people, your progeny, they're going to go into Egypt, and they're going to be there for 400 years, and they're going to be afflicted. They're going to become slaves. And also that nation, which is Egypt, whom they shall serve, will I judge. And afterward shall they come out with great substance, all of which we know historically took place. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So when Israel left Egypt, the 10 plagues and all that, they wandered in the wilderness afterward for 40 years because of their sin. And they were greatly afflicted by the Amorites during that time. He's prophesying about all that. And it shall come to pass that when the sun, and it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. Now this is God. Where's Abraham? Abraham's off. Abram, he's not Abraham yet. Abram, he's off to the side and he's sleeping. He's asleep. And God comes down and God passes between the pieces. In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaims and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. Those were the people that were in that land that Israel eventually would come and would conquer and take the land. The point is that in this tremendous, stupendous covenant that God is making with Abram, Abram had no part, no physical part in the covenant. When God told Abram, I will give you a son, there was nothing Abram could do to make that happen. And now when it comes to a covenant between the two, Abraham is put to sleep and God passes between the pieces by himself. Abraham had no part in that. There was nothing that Abraham could break to break the covenant. So there was nothing Abraham could do to seal the covenant. So Abraham's off to the side asleep, and God himself passes between and seals the covenant. Folks, that is salvation. That is what I have been trying to get you to understand from the start. Salvation is a covenant between God and sinful man that God passed through himself without our participation and without our help. Now, so many people keep getting on here and say, you have to be baptized. You have to take the Eucharist. You have to join the Catholic Church or the Church of Christ or the Baptist Church. You have to do this. You have to do good works because you have to do your part, because that's your part of the covenant. You have no part in the covenant. You have no part in the covenant. You never have. And you never will. And if you do not simply rest in belief in the finished covenant that Christ did, there is no covenant. When Abraham awakened, all that was required of him was to believe what God said. Not to walk between these pieces. Not to go out and find a way on his own physically through, what do they call it? In vitro fertilization or whatever else to try to do his part, to keep his part of the covenant. He had no part in the covenant except for to believe the work that God did by himself while Abraham was asleep in a great horror of darkness. You, as a sinner, are in a great horror of darkness. And while you were in that great horror of darkness, God made the covenant with you and did not ask or demand that you participate in any way, because as a human, you would just fail. You would just break the covenant. He did it. And you wake up and see what he did and recognize what he did and recognize that you have no part in this covenant except for accepting it. And if you don't do that, you're not part of the covenant. The one thing that's been asked of you, the one thing that's been required of you, you can't even do that. You can't even do that. The covenant has been completed, and it was completed by God while you were asleep in a great horror of darkness. Now, can you imagine the foolishness of if Abram had awakened and realized what had happened and had to run up and down in between them animals by himself? How angry God would have gotten. How pathetic it would have been. That's you. If you're running up in between them carcasses by yourself after God's already done the job and gone and said, I did it. There's a covenant between you and I perform the work. All you have to do is believe it. And yet you want to go and get dunked in water. You want to go and get wet. You want to go genuflect before some other man and let him put a cookie in your mouth and call it the body of Christ. I'm doing my part. You have no part in the covenant. You have no part. And if you try to make a part in the covenant, you're telling God you're not enough. You're not enough. I have to do it. And God says, you can't do it. You can't do it. You couldn't do it. You were in a horror of darkness of sin. So I did the covenant. The work is done. When Jesus died on the cross, his last words were, it is finished. What was finished? The covenant. The covenant was finished. That's why the giant curtain in the temple was ripped and torn in twain. The curtain that separated God from the people, and the people had to pick a high priest and they had to do all these sacrifices. God said, nope, it's done. It's done. It is finished. I took care of the covenant. You want to be a partaker in the covenant with Jesus Christ? Simply look at the finished work he did and accept it. Anything else is going to cost you your eternity. You say, Dwayne, that's harsh and that's scratchy and that's hard. It's better than going to hell. When you die and stand before God, if you hear these words, they're going to be a witness. They're either going to be a witness to you right now, or they're going to be a witness against you at the judgment seat of Christ. And God will say, look, I made it as simple as I could. I gave all these illustrations. I gave all these examples. I laid all these scriptures out. And I even had that foolish old cowboy break it down as simple as is humanly possible. And he told you, in no uncertain terms, he told you the truth. But you, in your pride and your arrogance and your lack of faith in my work, would not let you accept it. Depart from me. I never knew you. You have no part in the covenant except to accept what he already did. What he already did. While you were asleep in a horror of great darkness. I will not stand before God and be judged for not telling you the truth, regardless of how hard that truth is, and regardless of who it angers and upsets. I'm not going to carry that burden. The covenant's already been done. You can't go make a baby until God opens Sarah's womb. You can't do it. You just believe God and God counts it for righteousness. And you could not get up out of that horror of great darkness and walk with God through those sacrificed animals, because God did it. I hope you understand. I hope the light comes on, and I hope you have the faith and the courage, because your eternity depends on it, to do what needs to be done. Okay? All right. We'll talk to you guys next time.